Europe, December 1944. Snow fell in heavy, silent sheets, the kind that buried sound, swallowed breath, and erased footprints. But nothing could erase the thunder rolling toward them from the east. 18 men. That was all that was left of Charlie Company, 394th Infantry Regiment, scattered survivors of the American front, cut off behind enemy lines in the freezing forests of Belgium. They were cold, hungry, and half believing they were already dead. Their orders were simple: hold the crossroads. But what they didn't know was that the crossroads they now guarded would soon become one of the most desperate stands in the entire war. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Hitler's last gamble, a massive counterattack designed to split the Allied lines and crush their momentum. In the confusion of that surprise assault, entire American units were surrounded, overwhelmed, or simply vanished in the snow. Charlie Company had been ordered to delay the German advance for just a few hours, enough time for reinforcements to regroup behind them. They didn't realize those few hours would turn into a fight for survival that would echo through history. Their commander, Lieutenant John Harper, was 27, older than most of his men, but younger than his own fear. He looked out over the small Belgian village of Lanzerath, where his unit had taken up positions among shattered barns and frostbitten hedgerows. The road from Lochmergerben twisted through the valley below, and somewhere down that road, the enemy was coming. The men dug in, shivering, their breath turning to fog in the cold air. Private Fields, a farm boy from Kentucky, muttered, "Feels like the whole damn war forgot about us." Sergeant O'Connor, the grizzled machine gunner, grunted back, "Don't worry, Fields. The war'll find us soon enough." He was right. Just after dawn, they heard it, the rumble of engines low and distant, then the metallic clank of treads. German armor. But what rolled into view wasn't a small patrol. It was a column. Dozens of vehicles, half-tracks, armored cars, and hundreds of soldiers in gray. Harper's binoculars shook in his hands. He counted, and stopped counting after 500. The 1st Fallschirmjäger Regiment, elite German paratroopers, veterans hardened by years of war. And they were marching straight toward 18 exhausted Americans with barely enough ammo to fill their magazines. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Harper said quietly, "We hold." Not because it made sense, but because there was no other choice. They had a single .30 caliber machine gun, 2 bazookas with only a few rounds left, and rifles already freezing in their hands. Their radio was broken. Their supply lines were gone. But they had high ground, decent cover, and a stubbornness that had kept them alive this long. When the first German scout crept up the road, O'Connor waited until the man was close enough to see the color of his scarf. Then he squeezed the trigger. The machine gun spat fire. The scout dropped, and in that instant, the quiet valley exploded into war. German infantry dove for cover, shouting commands. Mortar shells whistled overhead, smashing into the snow behind the American lines. Harper yelled for his men to spread out, firing in short, controlled bursts. For the first 10 minutes, the Germans believed they were facing a full American battalion. That illusion saved lives. But illusions don't last. Soon, the Germans began to flank from the tree-line, crawling through the snow, their camouflaged helmets blending with the frost. Private Fields caught sight of movement, fired, and the snow around him erupted as bullets answered back. He fell back behind a stone wall, shaking. "They're everywhere," he shouted. Harper's voice was calm. "Then make them come through hell to get here." The fight raged for hours. The Americans moved between foxholes, conserving ammunition, trading fire until barrels steamed from the cold. Snow turned to slush, slush turned red. Corporal Jensen took a bullet through his shoulder but refused to leave his post. When his rifle jammed, he grabbed a fallen German's weapon and kept shooting. O'Connor's machine gun overheated twice, and each time he poured snow over it and went right back to firing. Each minute they held, more German bodies piled up near the road. The advance slowed. The elite paratroopers, men trained to storm fortresses, were being held back by 18 freezing infantrymen with nothing but grit and desperation. By midday, Harper crawled along the trench, counting. He had already lost 3 men. Half their ammunition was gone. The sky was dark with smoke, and the snow had turned into a churned mess of blood and mud. But the road was still theirs. The crossroads still held. He looked at his watch. 1:15 p.m. They'd been fighting since dawn. They were supposed to delay the Germans for 2 hours. They'd already lasted 6. At one point, a German officer shouted through a loudspeaker, offering them surrender. Harper listened in silence, then shouted back, "Come and take it." The reply was another barrage of mortars. By late afternoon, the forest was littered with wrecked vehicles and twisted metal. German medics dragged wounded comrades away under the cover of smoke. Still, they came on, wave after wave. But every time they tried to break through, Harper's men answered with the last of their bullets, the last of their courage. The sun began to fall, bleeding red light across the snow. The Americans were out of grenades, down to their final magazines. But they were still alive. And somewhere in that dying light, a thought began to grow among them. That maybe, just maybe, they could hold until nightfall. Because sometimes, courage isn't about victory. It's about not giving up, even when the world already has. Lanzerath, Belgium, December 16th, 1944. Dusk. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold had only grown sharper, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The gunfire had faded into distant echoes, replaced by the soft, steady crackle of burning trees and the groans of wounded men buried in the drifts. Lieutenant John Harper crouched behind a half-collapsed stone wall, his helmet rim frozen white. He checked his watch again. It was almost 5 p.m. They had been fighting for 10 straight hours. He whispered, "They'll hit us again at night. They'll think we're too tired to fight." O'Connor gave a thin smile. "They're half right." A few men chuckled weakly. Even at the edge of death, humor was all they had left. By 6 p.m., the first mortar shell screamed in from the treeline. Then another. Then dozens. The world erupted again. Explosions tore through the snow, showering the trenches with dirt and ice. Men ducked low, covering their heads as shards of frozen ground rained down like shrapnel. Private Fields yelled, "They're trying to bury us alive." Harper shouted back, "Then we dig our way out." The night sky flickered orange as shells burst across the valley. When the barrage finally stopped, everything was silent again, except for the sound of boots crunching in the snow. They were coming. Through the smoke, the Germans advanced, hundreds of them moving in waves. Their breath came out in clouds, bayonets gleaming in the moonlight. Harper counted at least 4 squads advancing up the road, 2 more through the woods. He steadied his rifle. "Wait for them to cross the fence line," he whispered. The men held their fire, hearts pounding. They could hear German voices now, shouting orders, barking commands. Then one soldier stepped across the barbed wire, and O'Connor opened up. The .30 caliber roared to life, spraying a line of tracer fire across the snow. German soldiers dove for cover, but the field offered none. Around him, the survivors of Charlie Company were barely more than shadows, faces blackened by soot, lips cracked from the cold. Sergeant O'Connor was still at his machine gun, the barrel glowing faintly red, a thin line of smoke rising like incense into the darkening sky. Private Fields, the youngest of them all, sat against a tree, clutching his rifle and whispering a prayer to no one in particular. They were alive. Barely. The Germans hadn't attacked for nearly 20 minutes. That silence was worse than the fighting. Harper knew what it meant. They were regrouping. The 1st Fallschirmjäger Regiment wasn't going to give up. They'd been humiliated by 18 Americans, and now they wanted revenge. O'Connor muttered, "They're licking their wounds. Won't be long before they try again." Harper nodded. "Then we use the time we've got." He crawled along the line, checking each man, whispering encouragement that felt thinner than the air around them. Ammo was almost gone. Most had only 2 or 3 clips left. Their single bazooka had 1 round. The radio still crackled with nothing but static. They were alone. Night began to fall, slow and merciless. The snow reflected the last light, turning the battlefield into a ghostly glow of white and gray. Harper could see the German positions through his binoculars, flashes of movement, the glow of lanterns as they dragged bodies, reloaded mortars, and prepared for another push. The air filled with screams and smoke. Rifles cracked all along the American line, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like camera flashes on a nightmare. But the Germans were learning. This time, they didn't stop. They kept coming, flanking from both sides, crawling on their bellies through the snow. One squad reached a farmhouse on the right and began firing from the windows. Another crept up behind a wrecked truck, using it as cover. Harper ducked as bullets tore through the wall beside him. He turned to O'Connor. "Take the farmhouse." "Now!" O'Connor grabbed the last bazooka shell, loaded it, aimed, and fired. The rocket streaked through the night, a flash of orange, and slammed into the farmhouse. The explosion blew out the windows and collapsed the roof in a shower of sparks. The German gunfire stopped. "Good shot," Field shouted. O'Connor grinned, wiping soot from his face. "Guess we found our Christmas lights." But the fight wasn't over. Not even close. The Germans regrouped again, this time with grenades and flamethrowers. They crawled up the ditches, tossing explosives into foxholes. Private Mendoza caught one in his trench. He tried to throw it back, but was too slow. The blast threw him 10 feet into the air. Harper ran to him, dragging his broken body out of the snow. Mendoza's voice was faint. "Did we stop them?" Harper squeezed his hand. "You did, son." The boy smiled weakly and went still. By midnight, only 10 men were left standing. Their trenches were filled with ice and bodies. Every gun was nearly empty, and still they refused to fall back. The Germans circled them like wolves, probing for weakness. Flares lit the sky, bathing the battlefield in a sickly green light. Each flare revealed the same sight: 18 Americans reduced to a handful, still holding their ground. It was madness, but was also legend in the making. At one point, Harper thought he saw movement to the north, shadows darting through the fog. He lifted his rifle, finger trembling on the trigger. Then he heard it, faint voices speaking English. He froze. "Harper, it's reinforcements." A small patrol, 6 men from a neighboring unit, had somehow stumbled through the forest, drawn by the sound of the fighting. They slid into the trench wide-eyed. "Jesus Christ," one of them muttered, looking around at the frozen carnage. "You guys really held all this?" O'Connor spat into the snow. "Still are." The newcomers brought a little ammunition, a few grenades, and most importantly, hope. The next attack came at 2 a.m. This time it was brutal. The Germans moved under cover of darkness, using the trees as shields. When they got close enough, they launched flares to blind the defenders. For 15 straight minutes, the forest turned into a storm of fire and light. Harper shouted orders until his voice was gone. Fields ran ammo back and forth, slipping on ice, covered in blood that wasn't all his. O'Connor kept firing until his machine gun finally jammed. He threw it aside, pulled out his pistol, and kept fighting anyway. When dawn finally broke, the battlefield looked like a painting of hell. Black smoke drifted across the valley. Bodies, American and German alike, lay frozen in grotesque silence. The few men still alive could barely lift their rifles. They had done the impossible, held back 500 elite German troops for almost 24 hours. But Harper knew they couldn't last another hour. He looked at his men, what was left of them, and felt something he hadn't felt since the war began. Just before sunrise, the Germans launched their final assault. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was a massacre. The Americans fired their last bullets, threw their last grenades, and then fought hand-to-hand among the trenches. When Harper was finally struck and fell, the world went quiet. The Germans swarmed the position, only to find that almost every American had fought until their last breath. 18 men, surrounded, cut off, outnumbered 20-1, and still they had killed or wounded over 100 of Germany's best troops. The road to the Ardennes was delayed for nearly an entire day, and in that day, reinforcements arrived. That delay changed the course of the battle, and maybe even the war. Later, when German officers examined the site, one of them whispered, "Who were these men?" No one answered, because by then they were already gone, taken prisoner, wounded, or buried under the same snow they had defended. But their stand would live forever. Lanzerath Ridge, dawn, December 17th, 1944. The wind had changed. The sharp, cutting blizzard that had blanketed the forest had softened into a thin mist, curling through the shattered trees like smoke from a dying fire. The battlefield, once alive with the thunder of machine guns, now lay still, buried beneath a white shroud of snow and silence. Lieutenant John Harper opened his eyes slowly. Everything hurt. His vision swam in and out of focus. The air stank of cordite, frozen blood, and the acrid tang of burned oil. When he tried to move, pain shot through his shoulder, a bullet graze, maybe deeper. He couldn't tell. For a moment, he didn't even remember where he was. Then the memories came rushing back. The shouting, the explosions, the men screaming his name. The night that had lasted a lifetime. He turned his head and saw the remains of his line. The trench was half filled with snow, bodies, and rifles that would never fire again. Sergeant O'Connor's machine gun lay still, barrel cracked from heat, his body slumped beside it, one hand still clutching his sidearm. Private Fields, the youngest, had fallen only a few feet away, his frozen face tilted toward the rising sun. 18 had begun this stand. Now maybe 4 still breathed. Footsteps crunched through the snow. Harper tensed, instinctively reaching for his rifle, but a harsh voice barked, "Nicht bewegen." German. A squad of paratroopers appeared through the fog, weapons ready. Their uniforms were covered in frost and soot, eyes red from exhaustion and rage. They moved cautiously, scanning for movement among the dead. One soldier kicked Harper's rifle aside and leveled his MP-40 at him. Harper raised his hand slowly. As they walked, German soldiers glanced at them, some with anger, others with a strange admiration. They whispered among themselves, "Axe and manner, gegen 500. 18 men against 500. The story was already spreading. That night, the survivors were locked in a ruined farmhouse, guarded by 2 sentries with rifles. Inside, it was dark and cold, just a flickering lantern and the constant drip of melting snow from the broken roof. Reese sat against the wall, coughing blood. Heller tried to tend his wounds with nothing but a strip of cloth. Harper stared at the floor, silent. Every creak of the wind sounded like another gunshot. Every shadow looked like one of his men. He could still hear O'Connor's voice in his head. "We hold this line, no matter what." He'd done it. They all had. But at what cost? At midnight, the farmhouse door opened. The German major entered again, alone this time. He carried a small flask, set it on the floor, and sat across from Harper. "You fought well," he said simply. Harper didn't reply. The major gestured toward the flask. "Drink. You'll need it." Harper hesitated, then took a sip, bitter schnapps burning down his throat. "You Americans," the major said, lighting a cigarette, "you fight like devils. But you don't know when to quit." Harper gave a faint smile. "Maybe that's why we're winning." The major exhaled smoke, studying him. "Do you think you've won anything here?" Harper looked up, meeting his gaze. "We bought time." The German frowned. "Time? For my army," Harper said. "For the men behind us. For the people who will live because we didn't run." There was silence for a long time. Then the major said quietly, "Then maybe that is victory." He stood and left without another word. The German hesitated, studying him. This wasn't the proud American officer he'd expected. This was a man half dead, frozen, and beaten. Yet there was something in Harper's eyes. Not fear, not surrender. Something harder. The soldier finally muttered, "Gefangen nehmen." Taken prisoner. By noon, the remaining Americans, just 4 survivors, were herded together in the snow. Harper, his arm bandaged with a strip of torn uniform. Corporal Reese, limping from shrapnel in his leg. Private Dawson, barely conscious. And one medic, Doc Heller, pale and shaking from blood loss. They were surrounded by nearly 100 German soldiers, the same men they'd held off for a full day. The Germans watched them with a mixture of fury and respect. One officer approached, tall, immaculate uniform beneath a tattered greatcoat. His insignia marked him as a major of the Fallschirmjäger, the elite German paratroopers. He stopped a few feet from Harper and studied him for a long moment. "So," he said in heavily accented English, You are the ones who delayed my regiment." Harper said nothing. His lips were cracked, voice gone. The major gestured toward the battlefield. "You cost me 100 men. For what? A hill? A road?" He leaned closer. "Was it worth it?" Harper looked up at him, eyes dull but defiant. "It was worth it," he said quietly. "Every damn inch." The major straightened, his jaw tightening. For a moment, it looked like he might shoot Harper on the spot. Instead, he gave a curt nod. "Take them to the rear," he ordered. "They've earned their graves, not bullets." The prisoners were marched through the wreckage of the forest, a slow, painful trek through knee-deep snow. Everywhere they looked, they saw the aftermath of their stand. Burned-out trucks, shattered helmets, blackened craters where the earth itself had been torn apart. The once quiet Belgian countryside had become a graveyard. Days passed. The Americans were moved deeper into German territory, first by truck, then by train. They were packed into cattle cars, the cold gnawing through their clothes. Other captured soldiers joined them, men from the 106th Infantry Division, lost during the opening of the Battle of the Bulge. As the train rattled through the dark forests of the Ardennes, Harper realized the truth. Their tiny stand had become a small, but crucial piece in a much bigger war. Somewhere out there, the Allied lines were holding, buying precious time because of what they had done. Because of 18 men. In captivity, the days blurred together. Hunger, cold, interrogation. The Germans demanded information, unit strength, positions, radio codes. Harper refused to speak. Even when they threatened him, even when Reese was beaten, he said nothing. One German officer shouted, "You think you're heroes? You're fools. The Reich will crush your entire army." Harper just stared back. "Maybe," he said, "but not today." Weeks later, the prisoners were liberated when Allied forces broke through in March 1945. Harper, gaunt and limping, was reunited with the surviving men in a field hospital near Liège. Reese was missing a leg. Heller's hands trembled from nerve damage. Fields, Mendoza, O'Connor gone. A war correspondent asked Harper what had kept them fighting when retreat was possible. He thought for a long time before answering. "It wasn't orders," he said. "It wasn't glory. It was the man next to you. You fight because if you stop, he dies. That's all." Months later, back home in America, a small ceremony was held. The surviving men of Lanzerath Ridge stood in front of the flag, uniforms pressed, medals gleaming in the sunlight. But for Harper, the medals felt heavy, not from pride, but from memory. When his turn came to speak, he said only this: 18 men stood in the path of an army, and they didn't stand for fame or medals. They stood so others could live. That's all you need to remember. Years later, long after the war, an old man walked the ridge again. Snow covered everything, quiet, peaceful, beautiful in a way it never had been before. It was Harper, his hair white now, his uniform long gone, but his memory sharp as ever. He stopped where O'Connor's machine gun had once stood. Kneeling, he brushed away the snow and uncovered a small, rusted dog tag. He smiled faintly. "Still here? Huh," he whispered. Then he stood, looking over the valley, the same valley that had once been a killing ground. Now it was just forest again, silent and calm. And for the first time, Harper allowed himself to breathe. Narrator, documentary tone. They called it the stand at Lanzerath Ridge. 18 men who delayed 500 and bought the Allies a day that changed the war's course. History remembers battles by their size, but sometimes it's the smallest fights that decide everything. The war had ended, but not for everyone. In the spring of 1945, the world finally exhaled. The guns went silent, the skies cleared, and nations began to count the cost. Cities could be rebuilt, roads could be repaired, but the hearts of those who had fought, those would take decades. For Lieutenant John Harper, the war ended not on the battlefield, but in a small army hospital outside Paris. His wounds had healed, but sleep never came easy. Every night, he saw the snow again, the blinding flashes, the screams, the endless waves of enemy soldiers swallowed by the dark. He had survived Lanzerath Ridge, but in his mind he was still there. After the war, Harper returned home to Ohio. The town welcomed him with parades and handshakes. banners saying, "Welcome home, heroes." But when people asked what he had done, he simply said, "Just held a line for a while." No one knew what that line had meant. Not yet. His unit, the 18 men who had stood against 500, received no medals, no public recognition. In the chaos of victory, their story was buried under the avalanche of larger events: D-Day, the fall of Berlin, Hiroshima. Lanzerath Ridge was just another snow-covered hill in Belgium. Forgotten. Years passed. The men went their separate ways. Farmers, teachers, factory workers. Reese learned to walk again on a prosthetic leg. Doc Heller became a small-town medic, patching up children instead of soldiers. And Harper, quiet as ever, built a modest life. Wife, 2 kids, a small hardware store. He never spoke of the war. Not once. But every December, when snow began to fall, he would pause, and his eyes would drift toward the horizon, as if he were watching that ridge again. Then, in 1965, 20 years after the war, a military historian named Captain Thomas Bradley stumbled upon something extraordinary. While reviewing classified German field reports from the Ardennes offensive, he noticed a repeated reference. American resistance near Lanzerath, unexpectedly heavy, caused 20-hour delay. That line, simple but chilling, appeared in multiple reports. Bradley dug deeper, and what he found changed everything. The historian traced the names, the coordinates, the units. Slowly, the picture emerged. 18 American soldiers from the 99th Infantry Division had held off an entire German battalion, nearly 500 men, on December 16, 1944. It wasn't just bravery. It was tactical genius, a perfectly timed defense that delayed the Germans long enough for Allied reinforcements to arrive. Without that delay, the enemy could have broken through the Ardennes and cut the Allied line in half. Bradley realized something staggering. Lanzerath Ridge may have saved the Western Front. The U.S. Army launched an inquiry. Survivors were contacted, statements recorded, maps redrawn. For the first time in 2 decades, the forgotten names began to surface again. When Harper received the letter, he was sitting at a store counter, polishing a shelf. He read it once, twice, then quietly folded it and put it in his pocket. That night, he didn't say a word to his family, but his wife noticed something different in his eyes. A light, faint but unmistakable. A year later, in 1966, the surviving men of Lanzerath Ridge were invited to Washington. In a small ceremony, no parades, no cameras, they stood once again shoulder to shoulder. Their uniforms were long gone, but their bond hadn't changed. The officer who once commanded them, now Colonel Harper, stepped forward to receive the Distinguished Service Cross on behalf of his men. His voice trembled slightly as he read from a prepared note. "We were not heroes. We were soldiers who did our duty. And if duty means standing against impossible odds, so others may live. Then every man here was a hero, whether anyone remembers or not." For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, everyone in the room stood and applauded. It was quiet applause, respectful, sincere. Not for glory, but for remembrance. Still, outside those walls, the world didn't notice. The newspapers wrote small blurbs. No movies, no headlines. The story of Lanzerath Ridge slipped once again into the shadows of history. But history has a strange way of remembering. In the 1980s, a young filmmaker researching the Battle of the Bulge came across Bradley's report. The story fascinated him. 18 men holding off 500. He decided to include it in his documentary series. When the episode aired, veterans and historians around the world were stunned. Letters poured in. Viewers wrote, "How do we never hear this before?" For the first time, the names Harper, O'Connor, Reese, and the rest of the platoon were spoken aloud in living rooms across America. Lanzerath Ridge was no longer forgotten. In 2004, 60 years after the battle, a memorial was built on that quiet ridge in Belgium. A simple stone wall, engraved with the names of the 18 men. No statues, no grandeur, just names. Every year, locals still visit, school children, veterans, travelers. They leave small flags, sometimes photographs, sometimes just a note that reads, "Thank you for holding the line." Harper never saw the monument. He passed away 2 years before it was built, but his daughter attended the ceremony. Standing in the cold Belgian air, she looked out over the ridge and whispered, "Dad." They finally remembered. 18 men, 1 ridge, 20 hours that changed history. In the great machine of war, their names were almost lost. But courage has a way of echoing through time, through generations. They didn't fight for glory. They fought because they had to. And in doing so, they became the reason others could live. Today, the ridge looks peaceful. The forests have regrown. The snow falls quietly. Tourists walk the same ground where once machine guns blazed and soldiers cried out in the night. They see no trenches, no blood, only stillness. But if you listen closely, if the wind is right, you might still hear faint voices in the distance. The echoes of men who refused to yield.